In September of 2016, The Atlantic published an article written by Selena Zito entitled "Taking Trump Seriously, Not Literally." And she writes about the fact, and she's interviewing Trump and also observing a speech, and one of the many times where Trump cites some fact that is completely incorrect. And she writes, "It's a familiar split when he makes claims like this. The press take him literally but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously but not literally." And she writes, "When I presented that thought to him, he paused again and said, 'Now that's interesting.'" But this distinction was repeated many times, and most people quoted Zito, gave her credit. One person who didn't was Peter Thiel, who elaborated on the distinction at a talk at the National Press Club. And this was written up when he was asked about Trump's proposal to ban Muslim entry into the U.S., Thiel responded that he doesn't support it. He has misgivings about Trump's language, but then said, "But I think one thing that should be distinguished here is that the media always has taken Trump literally. It never takes him seriously, but it always takes him literally." It's something that has been repeated many times and is considered a fair representation of the different ways in which Trump's words are interpreted and Trump himself is understood. But the power of this observation not only lies in the fact that it might be a map that accurately represents the territory, but in the way that the map is drawn, because it's an example of what Max Atkinson refers to as a contrastive pair. And he discusses this in a wonderful little book, Our Master's Voices, The Language and Body Language of Politics. It was published back in 1984, and that contrastive pairs are one of several devices that have proven to be especially memorable, quotable, and in the case of public speaking, that brings out applause in the audience. Some examples of contrastive pairs include John F. Kennedy, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Martin Luther King, "I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Neil Armstrong, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And it's worth noting that that was not what he intended to say. What he had planned to say was that's one small step for a man. But the fact that the meaning still came through, I think, is a tribute to the power of contrastive pairs. Of course, it's also used in literature. Shakespeare, "To be or not to be? That is the question." And then there are the opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way." Now, Korzybski would remind us that this is an example of a two-valued orientation, but he himself would understand and I think admit to the utility of such formulations, and he himself often was very much associated with the pithy quote, "The map is not the territory." And in the discipline of rhetoric, going back to antiquity, this kind of formulation was known as antithesis. And Aristotle, in writing about rhetoric, argued for its effectiveness as a persuasive technique, noted its close relationship to the syllogism, manifestation of deductive logic, and what would also be characterized by Korzybski as Aristotelian thought. And I've chosen to use contrastive pairs rather than antithesis, because antithesis often implies the opposite, and while taking literally and not seriously, and taking seriously and not literally are opposites literally and seriously themselves or not. And I find that kind of interesting and worthy of exploration. And the term literally comes from the same root as literate, literacy, literary, literature, from the Latin word litera, which translates as letter, as in letters of the alphabet. To be literate is to be lettered, to know your ABCs. There, of course, is the added connotation in being literate of being educated, well-read, well-educated, cultured, beyond being able to simply read and write. And literally ultimately kind of translates to by the letter. Its analog would be verbatim by the word, word for word. So literally means to the letter, understanding and interpreting any form of linguistic expression in its most exact meaning based on purely denotative definitions, disregarding any connotative overtones. And the tendency to take things literally is often characteristic of individuals with autism. And this includes not being able to detect a note of sarcasm in someone's voice, or understanding that someone is kidding, joking, recognizing an exaggeration, and so on. It's also a common source of humor in the science fiction genre, in which a non-human character takes an idiomatic expression literally. For example, upon hearing that it's raining cats and dogs, the character might respond, there do not appear to be any feline or canine animals falling from the sky. Or being told not to rock the boat, the response might be, I fail to see how destabilizing a watercraft applies to our current situation. Or being told to shake a leg actually shakes the leg. We understand these kind of formulations as the opposite of literal speech, which is figurative speech. Idioms are one form of figurative speech. Another form is metaphor, a technique used in rhetoric and poetics. And for example, Ronald Reagan, in his 1980 address on election eve, A Vision for America, used the metaphor of America as a shining city on a hill, which was a metaphor that actually originated in a 17th century sermon delivered by Puritan John Winthrop before they sailed off for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then in 1989, in Reagan's farewell speech, he elaborated on the metaphor, and he said, I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, wind-swept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace, a city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity, and if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still. Apart from any subtle political message there, the point is that Reagan did not mean to suggest that the entirety of the 50 states form one enormous, continuous, elevated metropolis. Whether anyone listening to his speech took his words literally, I can't say, but I'm confident that just about everyone watching, listening, present at that point understood he was speaking metaphorically. So at this point, I'll also note that the word literally has changed a bit, and in some uses has come to be used in its opposite sense, as when, particularly younger people say, it literally made my head explode, in which case their cranium is still intact and no gray matter splattered about. But that's not what Zito meant in her quote, and it follows that the reference to taking things literally, we may want to take it with a grain of salt, which, I'm not talking about a low-sodium diet, but we ought to keep in mind that the link between literally and literacy is not coincidental. We're better able to understand and interpret language to the letter, which is about writing, exactly, precisely, faithfully, strictly when we have recourse to written documents as opposed to listening, and this relates to what Tom Zlatic was talking about before, listening to the spoken word. Writing gives us that ability to view and review language, to analyze and reflect and otherwise criticize and evaluate. General semantics stresses the distinction between statements of fact or propositions and inferences or assumptions, and it's not impossible to distinguish one from the other when statements are delivered orally, but it's much easier to do so when we can read and reread what's been said. Taking things literally is closely associated with taking things legally, with interpreting legal documents. And it's no wonder that the fact that systems of law, as we understand them, didn't exist until first systems of writing were in place. It's also, of course, essential for modern science to understand what's a fact and what's an assumption. So taking things literally means paying serious attention to the content of communication, to the words being used. And this implies uniquely to language as a symbol system. That's clear if you consider the alternatives. Can you take a photograph or a painting literally? Can you take a song or a melody literally? Can you take a ballet performance or a baseball game literally? And of course not, but we can take all of these things seriously, which means we're talking about a different kind of seriousness than seriousness associated with denotative meanings. In other words, we're referring to serious feelings and emotions as opposed to a kind of cognitive seriousness. And these emotions are connected to relationships, communication on the relationship level rather than on the content level, a distinction made by Gregory Bateson, Paul Watzlawick, and others. A serious relationship may involve trust, affection, respect, commitment. We perceive ourselves to be in a serious relationship, and listening, of course, Mary, we perceive ourselves to be in a serious relationship when we're listened to, understood, cared about, appreciated. Seen as important, held in high esteem. And following Kenneth Burke, as Corey mentioned, in his rhetorical theory, which was inspired in part by Korzybski and general semantics, we perceive ourselves to be in a serious relationship when we believe there's significant common ground and a high degree of identification with the other person. For Burke, the key to persuasive influence was to establish and foster a sense of identification with your audience. That's, of course, ideally reciprocal, but in the cases of mediated communication, that doesn't happen. So Trump supporters take him seriously in understanding his rhetoric as fundamentally saying, I am with you, I am one of you. It's a relational message of group solidarity reinforced by creating a strong sense of boundaries between us and them, as they're defined all over in so many ways. And it's further indicated by the use of code words and dog whistles. For example, using the term globalist, taken literally, sounds just like a political stance or economic stance, but has a long history of being used in anti-Semitic discourse. Or referring to refugees from Central America as a caravan, a word that has Middle Eastern overtones and goes along with suggesting the presence of Islamic terrorists somehow in this group of Guatemalan refugees. And so it's another form of figurative language used to either mask the truth or create plausible deniability while reinforcing group solidarity. It's taken seriously by those who are able to decode it. Now, the problem for journalists is that their professional training is all about taking public officials literally, because Trump's discourse operates so far outside the norms of political rhetoric. Professional journalists really found it hard to accept him when he was campaigning as coming out with serious propositions, and assumed that they was joking, lying, doing things for entertaining effect or so forth. And they continue to take him literally, but also have now tried to take him seriously since taking office. But they find themselves on the safest ground by looking at how his supporters take him seriously. Now, the point here is that this goes, first of all, is the ambiguity, because we say they're not taking him seriously, and yet, not taking him literally, but then at times he does seem to come out with statements that are taken literally, like building a wall and then arguing for the funding to do that, or the Muslim ban as not figurative but literally in the policies that they're trying to enact. So there is the ambiguity, but really it comes down to this, which is that for a democracy we need transparency. And this is Jürgen Habermas talked about communicative action, which is understanding the literal meaning of policy proposals, legislative acts, and judicial decisions. If we don't take things seriously, all we have is entertainment. And if we don't take things literally, all we have is propaganda. Trump is great at both propaganda and entertainment. What we need for the survival of democratic culture is neither, to take things both literally and seriously before it's too late. Thanks.